window.
It's a super good transition to the third thing that we're going to talk about.
Cool. Nice.
Because it is about developing a habit. And that, the big word that you got, or term that you guys need to learn here, is anterior cingulate. Now, I'll get to that in a second, so put a little pin in it. Okay, I'm going to give you a cross-section of my brain.
Okay.
Got it?
Yep.
Okay. Right up here, we just talked about it, is the prefrontal cortex, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the prefrontal cortex is the logical, rational part of the brain. Now, I want you to think for just a moment, if you have a faith that is fueled by a highly developed prefrontal cortex, that's going to be a logical, rational faith.
Yeah.
You would even say that an atheist has a faith that is fueled by a highly developed prefrontal cortex, right? Now, back to the profile. This part right here is awesomeness. But besides that, what we're going to look at right here, it's actually a little bit inside of this spot. It's at the between the stem of your spine and right at the base of the brain is this little almond-shaped thing called the amygdala. The amygdala is the fear center of your brain. It's also anger, but it's dominantly fear. And if your brain has, when you like go into a fear freak out space, you're walking through a haunted house and you get panicked about something, you know, it overrides your prefrontal cortex and you can't think logically or rationally. You might even be aware, I'm not able to think logically right now. You know, even if you didn't use those words, you know, I shouldn't be afraid right now, but I can't seem to get beyond this fear that I'm feeling, right?
Yeah. So
they kind of can stamp each other out. Now, I knew about those two. The part of the brain that I've just recently learned about is just fascinating to me. And back to our profile here, it's right in here. It's between the two, between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. We got the shiny thing going here.
That looks great. Yeah.
And it's called the anterior cingulate. It's a buffer zone, and it's right behind the prefrontal cortex. And it acts as a balance between the fear center of the amygdala and the rational, logical thought of the prefrontal cortex. Now, think of these three spaces. If you have a faith that's driven by the prefrontal cortex, logical, rational faith, not such a bad thing, but it kind of lacks the passion and vibrancy that we hope for in faith, right? You know, a lot of people who can rationally and logically explain what they believe, but they seem to have a pretty spiritually dead life, right? Yeah. On the other hand, if you have a faith that's driven by a highly developed amygdala, then you have a fear-based faith that usually shows up as legalism because you're trying to appease a wrathful God. And that's certainly not the faith that we want in our teenagers. But here's it's a really new discovery in the last couple of years. If you have a highly developed anterior cingulate, that allows you to understand and conceive of a God who is compassionate and personal. Two key words. Now, isn't that what we want? We want our teenagers to, and ourselves for that matter, to understand a God who is compassionate and personal. And as we developed an understanding of a God who is compassionate and personal, we also then develop the ability to notice needs in others and exercise compassion toward them. So the big question is, how do we develop our anterior cingulate? If I want to have a faith that's really flowing out of a highly developed anterior cingulate rather than my amygdala or my prefrontal cortex, how do I do it? So the lead researchers on this stuff are two neuroscientists who are not believers. One would describe himself as spiritual, and the other would describe himself as a naturalist. He uses that term instead of atheist because he's trying to avoid the meaning of that. So that adds credibility to me, to this, because they're not trying to build up a belief system that they already had ascribed to. And they say the number one way to build the anterior cingulate is prayer and meditation. And it's got to be kind of hopeful prayer and meditation. It can't be fear-based, right? Yeah. They did one particular study where they got people who had never really experienced prayer and meditation before, and they got them to commit to 8 to 10 minutes a day. They measured the activity of their anterior cingulate before starting and then at multiple points through this process. And by the 2-month mark, those people had experienced an average growth in actual size and functionality of the anterior cingulate by 50%. And that development was permanent is what the the scientists said. And so the reality is, if we can help teenagers develop a habit, and if we ourselves can develop a habit of 8 to 10 minutes a day of prayer and meditation, hopeful, reflecting on scripture or on the characteristics of God, then that will develop this part of our brain that helps to tamp down the fear and help us to understand God is compassionate and personal, which revolutionizes faith. The second most important way to develop the anterior cingulate is faith-based singing. So I've been thinking, you guys, like, it seems to me that maybe one of our top youth ministry priorities, more than anything else, should be helping teenagers develop a daily practice of meditation and singing.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's so good.
Like, if we want them to have a vibrant faith for the rest of life, more than just be entertained and say Jesus is my homeboy for a few years that they're in our groups, we want something more long lasting than that. Then this is it. And in short, this is how prayer changes us. I'm sure that you all, as have I, have often told teenagers, hey, prayer changes God, but it also changes you. Well, this is scientifically how prayer changes you.
Wow.
Jeepers Creepers.